This is WGTE, Channel 30 in Toledo, beginning another day of public television programming.
Model Railroader Video Layout Tour number 2. Presented by Model Railroader Magazine. What you're going to see and learn is more than if you were on a layout tour. It's as if you spent hours with each layout builder and then condensed the information on his method and philosophies into detailed notes for later reference. But in addition to those notes, you're going to see trains running. Let me give you a sample of what's in store. The scenic effects on David Barrow's Cat Mountain in Santa Fe are the result of careful planning. He designed it so you can only see one scene at a time, sort of a diorama effect. This layout is actually 2 layouts in one. Each can be operated separately. Don Santel built the Ohio, Michigan, and South Shore, and his son built the Murphy's Creek. This Appalachian Railroad has the feel of a real transportation system. We'll see if we can get the builder of the Virginian and Ohio, Alan McClellan, to tell us how he did it. For a change of pace, we'll visit Mike Danneman's Denver and Rio Grande Western. Mike is a young artist who knows how to apply his skills to his model work. This is the East Broad Top of Doug Taylor. His narrow gauge railroad interchanges with the Pennsylvania, which Doug is building in the same room. So far, only the East Broad Top is nearing completion. How's this for a prototype? The Santa Fe between Kansas City and Ottawa, Kansas. Chuck Hitchcock has based his layout on that territory. Model railroaders always want more space for the layout. Sometimes the solution is an agreeable spouse. Other times you have to raise the roof. And that's what David Barrow did with his Cat Mountain in Santa Fe. David.
Hello, Alan. Nice to see you.
Good to see you. What prompted you to literally raise the roof?
Well, in the beginning, we had a sloping roof on the garage here, and in order to get more space for the railroad, we had to make the roof level.
David used Code 70 Flex Track on the HO Cat Mountain in Santa Fe. The minimum radius on the 275-foot main line is 30 inches. The bench work is open grid with paneling to the floor. Turnouts are number 6 and number 8. He completely redid the layout in 1980 and expanded the building to 24 feet by 36 feet.
Let's begin our tour of the Cat Mountain in Santa Fe here at Slayton. The western lines of the Santa Fe come onto the model portion of the railroad here at this staging yard. The first town down the line from Slayton is Rock Point. As we come into town, we see an interesting gravel industry and a complicated switching area, and we employ a local switch engine here, which, with the carrier control, we can use in concert with a way freight engine for 2 trains switching at the same time. Rock Point itself stretches on down in a long, thin shape here and has some other industries which provide local switching. The next town on the railroad eastbound after Rock Point is Waterline, Texas, a small town. It has a passing siding and some local industries to be switched by the way freight. Leaving Waterline, there's a fairly short run around to Mesa. Mesa is a model of a division point type yard. It's located in about the middle of the run of the district we're modeling here. And leaving Mesa Yard, we pass behind the roundhouse and engine terminal, across the bridge and into Cat Mountain, which is an industrial switching area. From Cat Mountain, we find the highest point on the railroad here, and from there we continue down grade into Summit. Summit, Texas is an ordinary little town. But perhaps one way to make a model railroad look more like a real railroad would be to emphasize the ordinary. Continuing down grade, we come to Ellison. I named this town for Frank Ellison, a famous model railroader of the 1940s and 50s, who I admire very much. And in this town, I put in a long passing siding and a third siding, and with these, we can have some very interesting meets during operating sessions. After Ellison, the next town down the line is Gravity. To get there, we cross a very nice steel deck bridge that Jim McAllister built across a dry wash. and then come into Gravity. Gravity is an interesting place because it contains the interchange with the Missouri Pacific Railroad coming from Memphis onto the Cat Mountain and Santa Fe. This is Brownwood, the end of the line on the Cat Mountain and Santa Fe. From here, we connect through Temple to Houston on the Santa Fe Railroad.
You're modeling the area between Slayton and Brownwood, Texas, not the Santa Fe as such. The Cat Mountain replaces the Santa Fe in that area. Tell us about that, the concept.
Well, the reason I did that was that it saved me from having to model the towns exactly as they are. And it gave the freedom to choose our own names, which for whatever reason we wanted to pick one. And then we could select industry sidings and design the towns. And what interests me most in model railroading, I suppose, is trying to create an acceptable overall effect. I'm not, in my opinion, a very good craftsman, and I don't have talent in other areas, but what I do have talent in is what an architect would have, is the ability to create the overall effect.
Well, part of the overall effect is making the layout a nice place to be.
Yes.
You've gone to a lot of trouble there.
Well, another thing that I believe about model railroading is so many of us model railroaders spend a lot of time building quality models, but then the setting in which we view them is not so good sometimes. And so what I call cosmetics of the layout room is paramount to me.
Let's talk about the arrangement of the track plan or the diorama style of presentation that you use. I think that adds really to the feeling that this is a transportation system that's going from one place to another because you see only one scene at a time.
That's the idea of it, and an around-the-wall type of arrangement is the easiest way to have a diorama effect. We, on a previous railroad, we tried to divide the scenes with masonite dividers that went up to eye level only. And then it occurred to us later on when we were building this version of the layout that if you carried walls to the ceiling in some kind of a spiral pattern, why, you could create the so-called around-the-wall effect everywhere.
Did your visit to Alan McClellan's layout influence you in any way?
Well, this is about the third or fourth version of this railroad, and the change we made between 1 and 2 occurred after seeing and meeting Alan in 1975. And the version number 1 of the Cat Mountain in Santa Fe, which was published in Model Railroader, I forget the year, but some years ago, you didn't have the going past the one place, one time effect, which Alan promoted.
Let's talk a little bit about your concept of operation.
We can operate the railroad with as few as 4 people if we have to, by eliminating one mainline engineer and then eliminating either the dispatcher or the yard operator. And we found that in general, one of the great banes of operation or something preventing good operation is having too many people. We have better sessions when we have fewer people than we do when we have too many.
Your CTC panel appears to be prototypically correct. Tell us a little bit about that.
It's a model of a Union Switch and Signal Company panel of the old 50s era. They're now all being replaced, probably on the Santa Fe. They've all been replaced by computer-operated boards now.
What kind of control system do you use?
We use the carrier control system made by PSI. It's called Dynatrol. And the throttles are operated by model airplane radio control units that have been rebuilt by Ken Thompson, who's the electronics man on our railroad. He built the CTC board and the radio system with help from others.
How does it work?
You have a handheld controller. We'll show you one of those in a small box. You can, and then there is a unit hung under the bench work. And we have, I think, the only one right now that you can dial up a channel. The PSI system requires plugging in little plugs to the controller they sell, but Ken built a sort of a Rube Goldberg type contraption that enables you to actually dial the channel on your handheld unit. So all you have to do, you don't have anything to carry around with one little box and a piece of paper as a switch list.
How did you build your structures?
They were built mostly by other people. I've built some of them, the roundhouse and some of the buildings. Andy Sporandio built some years ago, and other people. Jim McAllister's working on some now that are not finished. We've been very fortunate in Austin here, and I've been fortunate to be blessed with some talented friends. And
Oh, that's a help.
it is a help, and we've also been lucky that for the most part, they don't like to do the same kinds of things. Some like to do one thing and some another.
Yeah.
And so I've been able to get them to do most of the things I don't like to do or I'm not good at myself.
What one thing do you want people to remember about your railroad?
It's not so much what you do, it's what you avoid. Don't have anything that jumps out at you. I think Alan McClellan's written very well about that. Weather everything and try to make it look more like a railroad and not like a model railroad. Well, I hope you enjoyed your visit to Texas.
I sure did, and it was hot. Thanks, David.
Bye.
David Barrow was influenced by Alan McClellan, as you heard earlier. Another modeler who was influenced by Alan is Don Santel, but his Ohio, Michigan, and South Shore is suing the Virginian and Ohio. Don.
Well, hello, Alan.
Hi. You and Alan live in the same city. You're friends. So why the lawsuit?
It's a friendly thing. We have fun with it. My hump yard works, his doesn't. I'm still ahead of him. But it's a little bit of rivalry that keeps things going and for both of us on our layouts.
The HO Ohio, Michigan, and South Shore features hand-laid code 83 track on the main and hand-laid code 70 in the yards. The minimum radius is 24 inches, and the turnouts are number 5 and number 6. The Murphy's Creek of his son John is really steep with a 12% grade. The minimum radius is 16 inches. The turnouts are number 5, and the track is hand-laid code 70. Both layouts are contained in a 12-foot 3-inch by 38-foot 6-inch room.
This is the beginning of our tour, the Ohio, Michigan, and South Shore. This is our Sulphur Grove Yards. It is also the division point between our northern division to Adrian, Michigan, and our eastern division over to Fly. Here are our retarders in our hump yard, and they are operating, by the way. The hump tower and the yard tower, control tower, the scales, the oilers, and the inspection pits.
And that's Dayton in the background.
Leaving the Sulphur Grove Yards, we come to the community of Hearthstone, proceeding on down to the east, onto some hidden trackage, passing siding at Cedarville. We then reappear, coming into the town of Mount Sterling with its industries, some hidden trackage, coming up the hill, across the Scioto River into the town of Asheville, again across the Scioto River, and heading then on into Lancaster. We have quite a bit of heavy industry here to generate our traffic. Small yards, interchange with the V&O off their Ashland division, and the Carbon Hill branch leaves over to the east over there. As we leave Lancaster, we approach the town of New Lexington and the strip mine. We have the branch line going to Carbon Hill up high on the hill here with the Max Tipple and the truck dump. Behind us are a couple of the mines. The main line then proceeds through Coal Run Siding, down past Reinard Mills, and eventually ends up in the town of Fly. We have the fabulous Pittsburgh Prefab Pothole Company as one of our leading industries here in town. As we leave town, we then start approaching the East Falls Yards, the terminus of the Ohio, Michigan, and South Shore on the eastern side of Ohio along the Ohio River. We make interchange here with Murphy's Creek, and at this time I'll turn you over to John Santel, the superintendent of Murphy's Creek.
Hi, Alan. Welcome to Sistersville.
Hi, John.
You're standing in the Ohio River.
Okay.
This is Sistersville.
West Virginia.
Yeah. The Murphy's Creek has two major industries, the rough coal up here and Mauer lumber. We also interchange with the Virginia Midland and my dad's river, the Ohio, Michigan, South Shore.
Well, thanks, John, for the tour.
Sure.
Let's talk some about that imagined feud with Alan McClellan and the V&O.
It's really not an imaginary feud. It's a good live thing. I can document this back to 1974. The Ohio, Michigan, and South Shore made the pattern work, had the castings made, installed retarders, the air mechanisms, and so forth. And the V&O kept putting things off. They were more worried about lichen, changing paint schemes, updating the layout. And they got quite a bit of publicity from the trade magazines. Try to soothe things over. They named the yards after me with the retarders that don't work.
Well, let's see that famous hump yard in operation. Why don't you tell us about it?
We're using approximately about 12 psi on the line. A solenoid operates or electrical solenoid operates the air valve. We have 5 jets pointed at approximately 45-degree angle. These jets are inserted in between the tracks in the retarder area. And if you do it right, you can bring a car to a stop, hold it in the retarder, and with a little luck, release it just in time for the next car coming down to couple in the retarder and move on out. We're using basically Athearn roundhouse trucks on the cars now, stock trucks. I finally got an engine that was running slow enough and good control. This changed, again, the grade on the hump. So the bench work underneath the hump area looks like Swiss cheese from where it's been moved up and down and screws put in and taken out. And to this day, and I honestly say it, I could give somebody some ideas on what grades to possibly use to build a hump, but whether they would work on their particular layout or not, I can't guarantee it.
Modelers around Dayton seem to be hooked on interchange with other model railroads. Why is that?
If the prototype is going to interchange, why shouldn't the model railroad? I wouldn't say that we were the first to start a system map of the Dayton area model railroads, which goes back into, I believe, in 1966 when Al McClellan came up with the idea of printing a systems map. And this gave us something to look at if we were building a new railroad or a layout or an existing one, what connections we could make.
How did you and your son get started in working on the layout?
Well, it was easy for me. I've been building layouts, scale layouts, since, as I said, about 1946, 1947. I think that it made our relationship much closer, not only with the boys. The girls have done things. We've had a tree building operation where the whole family was involved in making pine trees. My one daughter has done some interior decorating on structures and things of this nature. So it's been something that really has kept the family together. They're all sort of model railroaders or train enthusiasts today. They would rather wait at a crossing to see a train go by than to race it and be on the other side.
What problems did you have in building the Ohio, Michigan, and South Shore?
Maybe the challenge, and maybe people won't see it this way, is coming up with a realistic-looking city or industrial area. I moved the Purina Chow or the Night and Day water heater, the Gruesome Casket, or the Swift meat packing, or whatever it might be, from place to place, left them set for a day or two, looked at them. Does the town look realistic? Do they look good in this position? If they look good, then I proceeded to, as the prototype would do, run my track to them.
What's the purpose of the railroad, both operationally and personally?
I would say it's probably the fellowship that we get out of it from the operating sessions that we have once a month. It's a funny thing. Normally, I don't operate. I sort of stand around and watch the other fellas have fun. The layout is not a job for me. It is a hobby. There's been times when I've looked at it and said, no way. There's other times when I've come home on a Friday night and she's seen me Monday morning when I've left for work. Well, Alan, thanks for making the tour down here. Hope you can come back again sometime.
We enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Say, would you mind taking this car down to the V&O to Al McClellan for some interchange?
I'll see that he gets it. Thanks,
Okay,
Don.
fine. We'll see you. Bye.
Bye-bye. I wonder if Alan McClellan's Virginian and Ohio regrets interchanging cars with the Ohio, Michigan, and South Shore. Why don't we find out? Alan.
Oh, welcome, Alan Keller. Pleased to have you to the Virginian Ohio Railroad.
Well, thank you. Here's a car Don Santel asked me to bring over. Has your philosophy of model railroad interchange caused you any problems other than the suit?
No, no problems at all. It's part of the fun of model railroading.
The HO scale Virginian and Ohio's 236-foot main line was finished in 1963, but Allen started planning it in 1957. He used L girder and open grid benchwork. The minimum radius is 30 inches. The track is mostly hand-laid, codes 55, 70, and 83. The turnouts were built in place to fit the location. The layout room is 23 feet by 33 feet.
Alan will start our tour of the Virginia and Ohio Railroad here at Afton. We have a mirror on the wall back there to give greater depth to the passenger terminal.
Oh, yeah.
Our locomotive servicing facilities here, with out the coal tower now, which was from the steam days, and a roundhouse that was left from the steam days that Don Santel made. Then we have our taller buildings along the wall there to give, again, depth and create the illusion of an industrial area. Here we have the Grand Valley interchange, and to hide where it runs into the wall, because they're just stub tracks, we put a highway bridge to hide those, Alan. And then we have the suburban area of Blackstone. We have a paper mill, a little depot that an antique dealer is going to be purchasing, and our connection with the Smith subdivision, which gives us our eastern gateway to the east seaboard. Here's the small rural community of Clintwood. It's served by the Valley locals, which the industries that are located here. But the important feature of Clintwood is the Durham subdivision coming in from the south. This gives us the connection to the southeastern part of the United States. Alan will come around the peninsula here that works as a sight barrier to separate Clintwood and Dawson Spring. And over here we have the Virginia mine number 11, Tipple, and we keep the helper engine off of the siding here at Dawson Spring. And that helps the train to go up to 2.5% grade towards Sandy Summit and then on to Elm Grove and Fullerton. Here at Elm Grove, the KCMB, which stands for Kelly Creek and Bradley Railroad, crosses over the V&O. We have the interchange track with the V&O here at Elm Grove, the servicing facilities for the KCMB, a freight house, and a small yards for storage of cars that come off the Patrick Coal Company. Here we have the town of Fullerton. We have charcoal kilns where they fire the hardwood and ship out charcoal by rail. The Tipple for the Patrick Coal Company that interchanges with the V&O here, and Dayton Shore Grip and Shore Company on the hillside that produces accessories for concrete construction. So we do have some industry served by rail. The main line loops on around through the valley here and up the hill towards Gage Pass. Gage Pass is the highest location that is physically modeled on the V&O. It's 58 inches above the floor, and just beyond Gage Pass we have Highland Y, which is around the laundry area, and that will be moved upstairs in the near future and allow us to do some more scenicking and detail work in that area. Alan, here we have Indian Hill and Jimtown. This is the western portion of the railroad that is modeled. We have our hump yards here named after Donald Santel. And this is, I mentioned, the western portion of the line. West of here is Kingswood Junction, which is our staging area located behind the dispatcher.
Your railroad is based on the clinch field. Did you try to duplicate the clinch field, or did you just try to capture the feel of an Appalachian railroad?
I would say I was after the feel of the Appalachian railroading. I always had been a fan of the Baltimore, Ohio, C&O, and the clinch field. In fact, in the early days in my toy train S-gauge transition period, I was modeling the C&O, and I felt that I could not do it justice and that the freelance railroad would be a better way to go, where I didn't have to follow exact prototype and could do the things that I was really interested in. And I liked the type of traffic that the clinch field had better than the Baltimore, Ohio C&O with a bridge route concept. So some of those concepts were put into the V&O, which is actually a fictitious railroad.
You have a lot of different ways of creating the feel of a prototype railroad. Paint schemes, numbering, family appearances. Tell us a little bit about how you do that.
Well, I feel the key word is balance between all of it and believable. I don't go for extremes or the unusual, the common types of equipment that were traditional for the area, paint schemes that represent the area. If you notice, the paint schemes on the V&O are very similar to V&O, C&O paint schemes, and they immediately are believable. And a lot of people think of the V&O as a real railroad, which I feel is quite a bit of flattery to me. And I think you got to go back and look at it right in the very beginning of the concept of the V&O. I looked at it and established the management philosophy. Even before I lettered the first piece of rolling stock. You know, it was going to be a conservative, as far as financial status, modest, not real rich, not real poor. So all of the equipment reflects this in the paint schemes and the way it's maintained, right on down to the structures and rolling stock included.
What do you enjoy the most, or what kind of satisfaction do you get out of the Virginian in Ohio?
Part of it is seeing it as a railroad or transportation system, which it was conceived that way right in the beginning. I felt that was one of the things that was missing in the early model railroading. They were a display for your trains, a place to run your miniature trains, not actually as a transportation system. And I've always had a lot of interest in the movement of freight and passenger trains, so I tried to incorporate this into the concept of the Virginia-Ohio Railroad.
What was the hardest problem you had to solve in building the railroad?
One of the things I did conceive right from the beginning, I always wanted a walk-around control where you walked into the scenes, again, to get the feeling of the crew being part of the train, as if they're the engineer and not sitting at a control panel halfway across the room, but right there where the action is, watching trackside signals. And
that was hard to do when you designed the railroad in the late 50s, wasn't it? You were even wanting walk-around control then, and that was hard.
It was not considered the way to go at the time.
No. Since you're famous for your operating sessions, let's find out how one of those works. You use computerized CTC. Tell us about your CTC panel.
Well, the CTC panel was, again, conceived right from the very beginning as the way to control the movement of the trains on the main line. Because of being a single-track main line, it was just a natural for it type of operation. And as I have found generally in model railroading, the best way to solve the problems of operation is go to the prototype and solve it the way the prototype does. So centralized traffic control would be the way of controlling a lot of trains on bridge route type of traffic over a single-track main line. The first CTC was installed in the early 60s, and then in the 70s, with the advent of computers and the solid-state technology, we were able to refine it, and we've now got a Intel 8085 microprocessor that controls the signaling. We're only controlling the signaling with the CTC. The crews with their cabs are actually controlling the movement of the trains. They have to watch their trackside signals just like on the prototype.
And that's command control.
Correct, yes, which is another thing we've used for over 20 years now as a form of command control.
Dawson Springs is an interesting area with its 2.5% grade. You use helpers there. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Dawson Spring was originally a passing siding, but it was the shortest one on the main line. And when we updated from 1958 to 68, we no longer use it as a passing siding because the train lengths are longer. So we store the helper engines on the siding now, and they are put on the rear of all the trains that require helpers up the hill to Sandy Summit, which is a 2.5% grade.
Interchange plays a large part in your operation.
We have the feeling that it's you know, connections to Chicago, to St. Louis, to the north and the east, and as you'll see on a diagram, how we think of it as part of a complete system of connecting, and this is part of that bridge route philosophy. And a lot of our traffic neither originates or terminates on the V&O physically. And actually, I've only modeled a very small portion of the theoretical V&O.
How has the V&O responded to the imagined lawsuit by the Ohio, Michigan, and South Shore?
Well, we're still friendly railroads. There are legal problems from time to time, so our attorneys are handling it, so I can't make any more comments at this time from the advice of our attorneys.
Do you enjoy the feud?
Yes, we do. It's part of the fun of model railroading.
What are your scenery techniques? Can you tell us?
Most of my scenery work is hand-carved into plaster and then stained with washes of oils. Although later I've been using acrylics now to eliminate the smell that my wife wasn't too happy about in the house for a month after I'd stained with oils. I use usually loose materials, ground lichen foams, dirt, ballast, and actually bond them then to the surface instead of trying to paint the colors, which gives you a little bit of 3D or texture to the surfaces. and the use of lichen. I've been doing a little bit of experimenting now with some of the foam-colored lichens and ways of achieving a little more realistic foliage than now is on the layout.
What about the structures? How did you build those?
The structures, I, again, try to find what I'm after, what I need as a end result. And then I go the easiest way to achieve that, whether it's a plastic kit, kit bashing, a craftsman kit, or a modified or straight kit.
So you use whatever is needed.
Whatever is
Fit
the
role.
easiest way to achieve. And I find that whenever you're creating a reasonably large layout, such as the V&O, you have to have time management. You know, to utilize your time to the maximum, and that's where an expression that I've used several times, good enough effect, where you have to know where to stop. I've got structures, backsides aren't finished. There was no need to spend the hours detailing the backside of a structure that no one would ever see, and try to get as much done overall. And again, it gets back to this balance so that the layout begins to look finished, even though really it's not.
What have you learned from building and operating the V&O?
It's a lot of fun. That's first of all, and met a lot of nice people and friends through the hobby. And it's made me more enthusiastic about the hobby today than when I've started. And I know now I've got more projects to do than when I started the railroad, which people say, what are you going to do when it's about finished? And never running out of ways of improving, making it better. Well, Alan, I'm pleased to have you on the Virginia-Ohio Railroad, and if you're ever back in this part of the country again, be sure and see us.
I'll do it. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome. Bye.
Bye. The next railroad on the tour is the narrow gauge Denver and Rio Grande Western of Herb and Mike Danneman. It's another father and son effort. Herb does the structures and Mike does the scenery. Mike also does the weathering and the backdrop painting. Hi, Mike.
Hi, welcome to the layout.
Thanks. As a young artist who specializes in railroad painting, does this help you, say, with your backdrop painting?
Yeah, by painting my own backdrop, I can create more distance and make a layout seem much larger than it actually is.
The HON3 Denver and Rio Grande Western is designed to follow the prototype track plan as closely as possible. The minimum radius is 16 inches. Track is both hand-laid and flex track. Mike and Herb started construction in May 1980 and plan to model a different season in each town. The 20 by 12 foot layout fits a 20 by 16 foot basement.
This is Durango, Colorado, where the prototype track plan is much like ours. And here's the loop that they turn the San Juan on every afternoon. Back there, I use some forced perspective to put the Silverton branch in there as it wanders off into the valley. I only have 4 inches back there to work with.
Yeah, very effective.
Right here is the Rio Grande Southern that goes to Rico and Ridgeway. This is their interchange point. Back there is my dad's depot that he built and has a full interior. This is a car shop and a roundhouse. Both are scratch built. This is the engine servicing where all engines coming into Durango were serviced. This is our major yards at the present. And over there is the water tank that has a little touch with a leak.
Oh, yeah, that's kind of nice.
And at this point, I'll turn you over to my dad with the next section.
Hi, Herb.
Alan, how are you? The mainline trains from Durango pass over the bridge over Cat Creek and arrive at the little community of Pagosa Junction. Here in Pagosa Junction, the mainline trains met a mixed train which ran to Pagosa Springs, which on the model railroad passes over the Y and into the background of the scenery to a hidden return loop. All of the buildings in Pagosa Junction are scratch-built except for the water tank. The main line from Pagosa Junction moves on into the little community of Dulce, and from Dulce it moves on into the uncompleted part of the model railroad, which will become Chama, and then up to the top of Cumbres Pass.
What portion of the Denver and Rio Grande Western do you model?
The narrow gauge portion from Durango to Cumbres Pass.
Is that unusual to model that particular area?
We haven't seen any layouts of that area, but it's nice to combine both the terminal of Durango and Chama.
You model the 50s.
Yeah, well, Durango is 1950. Pagosa Junction, which is the next town, is a different era. It's 1933.
Oh, why?
So while each section we do will be a different era, so we can cover all, like we can use different automobiles or different trains or different paint schemes and still be correct for each section.
I don't think I've ever heard of anybody doing that before. That's a most unusual approach.
That's a little different, but I liked Durango in 1950 with the flying Rio Grande and everything, and my dad kind of modeled the next town.
The backdrops you have are beautiful. What's your secret besides a lot of skill?
I just paint it. We take photos when we're in Colorado, and a lot of times we use color photos to base the paintings on.
How do you do it? What kind of paint? What kind of brush?
It's acrylic paint, and I just use a multitude of sizes of brushes and just try to rough it all in, according to how it looks.
Well, how it looks is you make 4 feet or so look like 20 miles. How is that possible?
Well, we use like a color to the backdrop. You would use it gets hazier and bluer as farther away it gets, and that's basically how you would do the distance bit of it. And then you also try to use this exact same colors. And what I did was I took the backdrop and I painted that first before any scenery, before even the bench work. And then you build the scenery to match the backdrop.
Is model railroading just another art medium for you?
Yeah, it's like 3D art for me.
Tell me about that.
I do fine art, paintings and that, and model railroading is just the other part of it where I do it in 3D, where I use brushes and all that, and weather, and it's just kind of like painting in 3 dimensions.
Let's talk a little bit about your scenery techniques. The results are beautiful. What materials and techniques do you use?
I use hydrocal plaster over newspaper, and that's basically the scenery. I color it with acrylics, of course, that carry over from the paintings, and dry pigments and woodland scenics, all different ground colors. That's, I think, an important thing when you're building a layout, is to have a multitude of all different scenery colors so that you can vary the effect.
How do you do your rock outcroppings?
Most of them are hand carved. There are a couple castings, but I've found that the castings look too much like castings, where if I carve it in there, it looks more like part of the actual hill or mountain.
What do you use for weathering?
I use airbrush, pastels, dry brushing with water-based paints and like folk wool. And sometimes I use real dirt too, so just about everything.
And you do all the cars, locomotives, the structures?
Just about, almost everything's weathered, which I think helps tie everything in too.
The water effects are dazzling. How did you do those?
First I base in the riverbed just like you would a scenery, and then I added some sand from the real rivers in Colorado and some rocks and that, and then I poured that liquid casting resin, Envirotex, which doesn't have that awful smell.
Yeah.
And then I added the cascading foam and that with rubber sealing cement, and you kind of stipple it. And then you dry brush a little bit too.
With white on
Yeah.
the top?
Yeah.
What are the best features on the railroad, in your opinion?
Just the ability for me and my dad to work on it together, I guess, would be the best.
And how long have you and your dad worked on it together? Has it always been a father-son
since it
project?
started, yeah. Since it started.
Do you sort of divide up the responsibilities, or how does that work?
I do the scenery, and my dad likes structures a lot, so he'll build, about half of the structures. And I like to build structures too, so I build the other half. And so we just kind of work on it together. He does the electrical work in the basement and some of the bench work and that, so.
Has it been fun? I mean,
Yeah.
has it brought you closer together, or are you able to talk to your dad more than if you didn't work on the railroad together? You have a common interest?
We always have, and since I was a little kid, he took us rail fanning and that, so we've always done things with this hobby together, so it hasn't changed.
Why did you pick Colorado to model?
We go on vacation there, and I try to recreate part of it in the basement so we can escape there once in a while without all the expense.
Is there something that stands out in your mind that you would like people to remember about the layout?
That no matter how much space you have, you can almost always build a layout that will fit in the space you have. I mean, it doesn't have to be big to be interesting or good or anything like that.
Thanks, Mike. I really enjoyed seeing how you combined your 2 interests, model railroading and art, in the layout.
Well, thanks for stopping by. Come back when we finish.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Since we're talking about narrow gauge, let's move east to Doug Taylor's East Broadtop. Doug is also involved in the arts as a professor of theater. Doug,
Hi, Alan.
Why did you decide to model the East Broad Top rather than Colorado narrow gauge?
I was raised in that part of the country, and besides, I wanted a railroad I wouldn't find in everybody else's basement. I wanted something unique, and I liked steel hopper cars and coal traffic, and the East Broad Top had that in interchange with my Pensy.
Doug Taylor has been a model railroader since 1944. He began work on the HON3 East Broad Top in December 1978. The Pennsylvania Railroad is up to the benchwork stage. He used L girder and open grid. The minimum radius on the EBT is 22 inches, and the maximum grade is 4%. Turnouts are number 4 and number 6. Doug used flex track. Both the Pensy and the EBT are in a 45 by 30-foot room.
Al, we're at Mount Union here, which is the start of the East Broad Top. You have the Pensy coming around Jack's Narrows here and going by with the interchange point here and continuing on into oblivion under the coal cleaning plant. And down here we have the yard office and all the dual gauge trackage, which is switched by the standard gauge switcher here. The coal cleaning plant gives us our major point reason for being, and we do the empties load swap here between the loaded Pensy hoppers and the East Broad Top stuff coming down from the mountain. Then down beyond, we have a non-prototypical tunnel that the East Broad Top disappears on its way to the town of Sotillo, and right overhead is the Robertsdale, which is really 42 miles away, but the mountain masks that fact. As we come into the Alwick Creek Valley, the railroad enters the scene through the roller door tunnel over here, and then crosses my model of the first reinforced concrete arch bridge in the country. Then the railroad proceeds on to Sotillo, which has a company store and 3 company houses for the various miners, and the Narco branch cuts off the station and goes up the 4% grade to the Gannis Rock Quarry. And this is where we get the rock for the brickmaking companies of Mount Union. Here we have the switch at Kimmel, the end of the passing siding, and the railroad ducks into the tunnel and continues up underneath Orbisonia to where it re-enters at the highway underpass. Orbisonia uses kit-built structures for the houses, and I scratch-built the station, roundhouse, and shops using white ground kit for the sand house. Here at Orbisonia, the track doubles back on itself and continues on past the coal dock into the tunnel and onto Robertsdale to give me my empty loads arrangement. As we come into the Robertsdale area, we have the strip mine here, which will eventually put the deep mines out of business. And then we have Robertsdale itself, which has the company store, the station, and the tracks here, which feed the hoppers into the tipple down here at the end of the line. And here we swap the empty hoppers for loads, a la John Armstrong.
Your East Broad Top looks like the times are good. Many narrow gauge lines that are modeled appear to be in their death throes. Why did you choose to model the East Broad Top during good times?
First off, I lived in the area. And secondly, 1952 allows me the steam diesel transition on the Pensy. And when I started modeling the East Broad Top, I really was doing the Pensy. And I did the interchange at Mount Union. And I discovered the East Broad Top was a railroad you could have one of everything they had and still not bankrupt oneself on that. And it was a prototype not many people were modeling. You see an awful lot of DNR GW stuff, but very little East Broad Top, and it was a challenge.
You've actually got 2 layouts in the same room, the Pensy and the East Broad Top. Why did you choose to model it that way, and why did you start on the East Broad Top first?
The East Broad Top was built primarily because we were living in a rented house at the time. I was without a layout and decided I needed to do a module. I had had John Armstrong design the master plan, and by the Christmas of that year, I was frustrated without the layout and decided, well, okay, I'll start one section, what can I do? And the only thing that made sense was the Orbisonia section of the East Broad Top. So I built that in the house. In fact, I built it in my scene shop, hauled it back to the house, detailed it. When we bought this place, we carried it down the basement stairs. After getting it stuck there and sawing off a corner to get it all the way down, we started the layout from that. In retrospect, it turned to be a wise idea because the Pensy is a vast undertaking, and the East Broad Top, by its very nature, was much smaller. And so within a year, I had an operating railroad down here, and when I get tired of construction, I come over here in the East Broad Top, and we can operate.
Have you applied your skills as a professor of theater to the railroad?
Oh, absolutely. I do an awful lot of illusion here. You'll notice, if you start looking at this thing carefully, I work with a number of very specific, reasonably well-detailed scenes, but then it cuts rather abruptly to the next scene. And I'm using every visual trick I know to distract the eye so you don't notice how abruptly we change, say, from Robertsdale to the Pogue Creek, which is 42 miles away. I have to selectively compress, adapt. In some cases, a mountain has to be steeper and higher to mask something on the other side of it, and so it's sort of a point of departure.
Another interesting feature is the empties in, loads out at Robertsdale and Mount Union. How does that work?
I have the classic John Armstrong concept. I come into Robertsdale with a string of empties, put the empties into the tipple, and after I turn the engine on the turntable, I know there should be a Y there, but there wasn't room for it, I pick up loaded hoppers from the same tipple. It's a two-track affair. On the other side of the mountain, 42 miles away, is Mount Union, and I there swap the empties and loads. Back there, loads coming down from Robertsdale are put into the coal loader, or coal cleaning plant, rather, and then I pick up the empties from that.
Did you have to solve any unusual problems in building the railroad?
Well, the biggest problem about building the railroad was finding a house to put it in.
Uh-huh.
I had had this railroad designed for a house in Ithaca, New York. We moved to Kansas City abruptly, and it took us about 4 months to find a real estate agent who would listen to the fact that I needed a 22 by 36-foot basement, minimum. I finally found a gal who listened. She saw the plans, and although I think she thought we were a little weird, the first thing we saw of this house was we came in through the garage and down the basement stairs. As I pulled the pull chain lights on, I realized I had a basement that was larger than what I needed. It was dry, and right where we were sitting was the remains of American Flyer layout. That clinched it.
What have you learned from building this layout?
That's a tough question. I think in some ways the layout is more a result of what I've learned on other layouts and applying it here. Obviously, I've learned a great deal about the East Broad Top. I've learned about an awful lot of interesting people in Kansas City who've helped me with primarily wiring, electronics, and scenery, and a great deal of friendly and constructive criticism and encouragement on the thing. But it's more a continuation of skills I started developing with my early Lionel set than something that's a body of information that's happened just because I've done this railroad.
Mm-hmm.
And that learning process will continue for as many years as I continue to exist. Alan, it was real nice to have you visit. Come
Thank
back
you,
again.
Doug. Thank you. Our final layout is based on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe between Kansas City and Ottawa, Kansas. Chuck Hitchcock's Argentine division captures the feeling of a real railroad because of this. Chuck.
Alan, how are you?
Fine. How are you?
See you. Fine, thank you.
Thank you. Chuck, what else do you do to create that prototype flavor?
I try very hard to model only the things that are typical on a railroad and not those things that are one of a kind.
A model railroader for over 35 years, Chuck Hitchcock started this HO layout in the fall of 1971. It has a 30-inch minimum radius, a maximum grade of 1.5%, number 6 turnouts in the yards, and number 8 on the main. He used L-girder benchwork. The layout fits a 50 by 30-foot room.
Alan, we began our tour of the railroad by following the main line coming from Chicago in a westerly direction, and Argentine is the first division point we come to, and this happens to be the passenger facilities where the passenger trains are serviced. We have a post office for the railway post office cars, a commissary to service the diners, the express building for the express mail. As we proceed in a westerly direction, we come to the freight yards at Argentine, where all the through freights are reclassified, engines are serviced, and crews are changed. Alan, this is the Argentine engine facilities where we service both oil and coal-burning locomotives.
Mm-hmm.
It's a beehive of activity on operating session. Of course, it has the turntable. As we leave Argentine, we head west on the main line, and the first little town we come to is Morris, Kansas. It's a little town located about 5 miles west of Kansas City, and it has about 6 or 7 industries located where the way freights do their switching. Interchanging with the Santa Fe at Morris is the Kaw Valley Railroad. And here we see the main line turn and go west, rolling through the typical hills of Kansas. And now we head towards Holiday. This is Holiday, one of my favorite places on the railroad, Alan, because it's a recreation of my boyhood memories. Interestingly enough, this was a bottleneck on the railroad, real railroad, and it's a bottleneck on the model railroad, but it makes an interesting place to watch trains. Alan, this is Ottawa. This is a single-track railroad we saw cut off at Holiday. The double-track line we saw went on to some staging tracks in the west end of the railroad. Ottawa is really a pretty loosely knit fabrication of what you would see if you went to Ottawa. And by that I mean it is simply created for some interesting switching possibilities. This is the end of the railroad. However, the track does continue on into some staging tracks.
You're modeling the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe between Kansas City and Ottawa, Kansas. How were you able to compress that size territory into a model?
Well, I took basically areas of specific high interest. For example, the Morris, little town of Morris, little town of Holiday. I tried to create key towns along the way. Holiday was modeled pretty much the way it looked in 1950, with the flavor of these rural structures. It was a little railroad junction is all it was, but I held to the fidelity of the prototype structures very, very accurately.
Why was Holiday so important to you?
Oh, as a 12-year-old person, I went out there with a good friend of mine. He went out to see his grandparents, and I went out to watch the trains. And I always thought in my own mind that someday I'd like to create Holiday in miniature. I always had that dream, and thus I have. And I enjoy watching trains almost as much in the basement here as I did at Holiday.
What do you enjoy most about the layout, other than Holiday and watching the trains roll through?
I think the layout creates an opportunity to associate with people and the operation. The railroad itself is nothing more than a stage, and we operate these trains, and we try to create the feeling that we're operating a railroad here. In fact, it's kind of a standing joke. I tell the operating crew that when they come in the basement, the railroad becomes full size or they become HO size. And we really take that attitude, and we try to seriously run the railroad as efficiently as we can.
What are the railroad's best features?
Al, I think the feature that I strove in building it was simplicity. Avoid the temptation to pack it full of track and create a spaghetti bowl with no particular theme, and really tried to create something that was pretty simplistic in its appearance. And I think most people who come and operate for the first time are a little bit odd when they see it, but when they operate, they soon realize that it is simple, that the railroad is simple to follow, understand, because it's basically a straight line.
You modeled 1948 to 1952.
Right.
Why did you pick that era?
Oh, again, I think it goes back to that's about the time I was 12, 10, you know, my years of 10 to 12 years old, and I think a lot of people want to create at those years, when you're that age, you want to create something, but you don't have the ability or the skill or the money. So when you develop a little of both, that you go back and reflect on those years that you were pleasant memories, and that's what I've done. I love the era because it combined the best of both steam and diesel.
Did you have any space problems with a railroad this big? You've got a large area for a railroad.
No, not really. I always said once in my life I'd try to build a railroad right, with the cosmetics and the features other than the railroad itself being done right. And we were fortunate enough to build this house, so I built it with an extra foot of foundation and eliminated the windows, and took some time to do some things in the basement before I started the railroad.
You enjoy passenger train operation, don't you?
Yes,
And you
yes.
run a lot of those.
Yes. One of my good friends and I have spent a number of years researching the flow of the head-end cars from railroad to railroad, and we are running about 10 passenger trains. Obviously, you can't run all the Santa Fe passenger trains. We hand-picked some passenger trains, and we operate those trains through this area, and we do some things with the head-end switching, the RPO cars or the baggage cars. We have a post office and the commissary, and we go through the process of servicing and the flow of those cars as they would have flowed. For example, we researched on the RPOs. There was a heavy flow of RPOs between Chicago and Kansas City, and they flowed on certain trains. There was head-end equipment coming from Pittsburgh, magazine cars that were going to the West Coast, and those came in an interesting way and were put into certain trains. And we try to pretty much simulate some of that flow of those passenger trains and some of that equipment.
I understand you once used instant coffee and food coloring for your scenery.
We have a fellow here in Kansas City that doesn't like railroads, but he loves to build scenery. And one of the things he used that I always was intrigued with was instant coffee. This is when it was priced very reasonably. He'd come with a huge bottle of coffee, and he'd put it in a cup and put a little water, and that's what he started coloring with. And I always thought I did a good job of creating the terrain color. Now, when coffee's got so expensive, I've gone to acrylic paints like everybody else, but the railroad always smelled good.
I've noticed some of the structures are kits, but a lot of them look like they're scratch built.
Right. I'd say a good many of them are scratch built, primarily because if you want to get a structure that's something that's unique, that isn't available, then you have to scratch build it. I'm for using any device that will get you the required results. For example, the depot at Ottawa is a facsimile of the Ottawa depot that still exists, an old stone structure. I didn't model it, but I used a Keebury old school and cut a third section out of it and did some kit bashing on it, and it's a facsimile. People say, oh, that's Ottawa.
How do you select your rolling stock and locomotives?
Oh, the rolling stock I started building, I think my first Barney paper-sided car I built in 1948. And started building. I love to build cars. That's always been an interest in. In fact, I overbuilt and had to get rid of a lot of cars. I had too many for the railroad. There's about 300 on the railroad now, but I had more than that. You build one and you put it away. But again, I'm limited pretty much by cars that you would have seen up to, say, the early 50s, nothing later than that. So I don't have a problem with all this late stuff coming out. I admire and enjoy a lot of it, but I can't have it on the railroad. So most of it's stuff that the old Astern steel kits and the globe and stuff. And I've got a lot of plastic on here, too, that, do a little painting, weathering on them. They look pretty good.
How do you select your locomotives?
Most of them are, a variety of brass engines where I've put new gearboxes or new motors in them to get the kind of running results that you want.
What are your feelings about weathering?
Well, I think it's got to look right, and I'm not for heavy weathering, but I like to have running weathering. Even on a so-called crack passenger train, I like to put a little bit of running weather on it. Pretty subtle looking, but at least it's there. And I think, again, it creates a feeling that you're looking at a railroad, not a model railroad, or not a model. It's been freshly painted, so a little light weathering.
What have you learned from building and operating the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Argentine division?
Oh, wow, that's kind of a tough question. I've learned an awful lot. Primarily because I've had some good people who have been willing to, share with me ideas. One of the great things about this hobby, there's not a competitiveness about it that someone won't, if you want to know something from me, I'll share it with you. I don't keep it here because it's mine, and I don't want you to know about that. I think it's just more of a confirmation. Certainly, I've learned a lot about, developed a lot more skill in whatever I had in the early years, doing scenery, working on locomotives, building structures, but I think the best thing about the whole thing is the association of people. There's not a finer bunch of people in any hobby. I'm convinced of that.
Alan, it's been good to have you on a visit to the Santa Fe.
Thank you, Chuck. I enjoyed it. All 6 of our featured layouts are truly inspiring. Each has some memorable highlights. The Cat Mountain in Santa Fe was built so you get the feeling of following trains from place to place. David Barrow did this by creating scenes that are visible one at a time. An operating hump yard and a father and son team. Don Santel's Ohio, Michigan, and South Shore has both, plus an imagined suit with the Virginian and Ohio. A model railroad with that prototype feeling is the result of Alan McClellan's craftsmanship and attention to detail. Alan is an operator who has kept abreast of and caused changes in the hobby. Mike and Herb Danneman's Denver and Rio Grande Western has the makings of three-dimensional art. The scenery, structures, cars, and locomotives all blend together, thanks to another father and son team. Doug Taylor has 2 railroads in the same room, the 4-track Pennsylvania and the narrow-gauge East Broadtop. Remember that dual-gauge interchange at Mount Union? 35 years in the hobby and a fondness for the typical have made Chuck Hitchcock's Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Argentine division into a slice of Kansas railroading. We all hope you enjoyed these layouts and learned something to make your own railroad even better.